It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Apollo was the NASA program that resulted in American astronauts making a total of 11 spaceflights and walking on the Moon. It was dedicated to President John F. Kennedy's national goal for the 1960s of landing a man on the Moon.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the Moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
NASA designed the Apollo Command Module for this program. It was a capsule with room for 3 astronauts. The astronauts rode in the command module on the way to the Moon and back. It was larger than the spacecraft used in the Mercury and Gemini programs, and astronauts had room to move around inside the spacecraft. Another spacecraft, the lunar module, was used for landing on the Moon. This spacecraft carried astronauts from orbit around the Moon to the Moon's surface, then back into orbit. It could carry 2 astronauts. 2 types of rockets were used for the Apollo program. The first flights used the smaller Saturn 1B rocket. It was about as tall as a 22-story building. The Saturn 1B rocket was used to test the new Apollo capsule in Earth orbit. The other flights used the more powerful Saturn V rocket. This 3-stage rocket sent the Apollo spacecraft to the Moon. It was about as tall as a 36-story building. Apollo 1, initially designated AS-204, was planned to be the first crewed mission of the Apollo program. It was planned to launch on February 21, 1967, as the first low Earth orbital test of the Apollo Command and Service Module. On January 27, 1967, tragedy struck on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy during a pre-flight test for Apollo 204. Astronauts Virgil Grissom, Edward White and Roger Chaffee lost their lives when a fire swept through the command module. The test involved a mock countdown with the astronauts wearing spacesuits inside their capsule, sealed and pressurized with oxygen. At the time of simulated liftoff, the plan called for the spacecraft to switch to its own internal power source. The crew also planned an emergency escape drill from the spacecraft at the test's conclusion. During the test, a flash fire swept through their spacecraft so quickly they had no time to open the hatches. The astronauts perished from toxic gases in the craft's environmental control system. Immediately after the fire, NASA convened an accident review board to determine the cause of the fire. The ignition source of the fire was determined to be electrical, and the fire spread rapidly due to combustible nylon material and the high-pressure pure oxygen cabin atmosphere. Rescue was prevented by the plug door hatch, which could not be opened against the internal pressure of the cabin. The exhaustive investigation of the fire, and extensive reworking of the Apollo command modules, postponed crewed launches until NASA officials cleared them for flight. Saturn 1B schedules were suspended for nearly a year, and the launch vehicle that finally bore the designation AS-204 carried a lunar module as the payload, instead of a command module. In the spring of 1967, NASA's Associate Administrator for Manned Spaceflight, Dr. George E. Mueller, announced that the mission originally scheduled for Grissom, White and Chaffee would be known as Apollo 1, and said that the first Saturn V launch, scheduled for November 1967, would be known as Apollo 4. The eventual launch of AS-204 became known as the Apollo 5 mission. No missions or flights were ever designated Apollo 2 or 3. The second launch of a Saturn V took place on schedule in the early morning of April 4, 1968. Known as AS-502, or Apollo 6, the flight was a success, though 2 first-stage engines shut down prematurely, and the third-stage engine failed to reignite after reaching orbit. Apollo 7 was the first crewed flight in NASA's Apollo program, and saw the resumption of human spaceflight by the agency after the fire that had killed the 3 Apollo 1 astronauts. The Apollo 7 crew was commanded by Walter M. Schirra, with Command Module pilot Don F. Isley and Lunar Module pilot R. Walter Cunningham. Apollo 7 was launched on October 11, 1968, from Cape Kennedy Air Force Station, Florida, and splashed down in the Atlantic Ocean 11 days later. Once the vehicle cleared the launch pad, a three-shift mission control team, led by flight directors Glynn Lunny, Gene Kranz, and Jerry Griffin, in Houston took over. Apollo 7 also saw the first live TV broadcast of Americans from space, and the crew held the first of 7 TV broadcasts on October 14. The Apollo Command and Service Module performed superbly. The spacecraft performed nominally for nearly 11 days, longer than a journey to the moon and back. With few exceptions, the other systems in the spacecraft operated as they should. Despite tension between the crew and ground controllers, Apollo 7 accomplished what it set out to do, qualifying the CSM and clearing the way for the proposed lunar orbit mission to follow. This gave NASA the confidence to send Apollo 8 into orbit around the moon 2 months later. In part because of these tensions, none of the crew flew in space again, though Schirra had already announced he would retire from NASA after the flight. Apollo 7 fulfilled Apollo 1's mission of testing the CSM in low Earth orbit, and was a significant step towards NASA's goal of landing astronauts on the moon. Apollo 8 was the first crewed spacecraft to leave low Earth orbit and the first human spaceflight to reach the moon. The crew orbited the moon 10 times without landing, and then departed safely back to Earth. The 3 astronauts, Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders, were the first humans to witness and photograph the far side of the moon in an Earthrise. Apollo 8 launched on December 21, 1968, and was the second crewed spaceflight mission flown in the United States Apollo space program. It was the third flight and the first crewed launch of the Saturn V rocket, and was the first human spaceflight from the Kennedy Space Center, located adjacent to Cape Kennedy Air Force Station in Florida. Apollo 8 took 68 hours to travel the distance to the moon. The crew orbited the moon 10 times over the course of 20 hours, during which they made a Christmas Eve television broadcast in which they read the first 10 verses from the book of Genesis. At the time, the broadcast was the most watched TV program ever. Precisely on time on December 24, 1968, Mission Control lost contact with Apollo 8. For the first time in history, humans traveled behind the moon and out of radio contact with the Earth. The crew of Apollo 8 became the first humans to enter the gravitational sphere of influence of another celestial body. The effect of the moon's gravitational force on Apollo 8 became stronger than that of the Earth. The Apollo 8 astronauts returned to Earth on December 27, 1968, when their spacecraft splashed down in the northern Pacific Ocean. The crew members were named Time magazine's Men of the Year for 1968 upon their return. Apollo 9 was the third human spaceflight in NASA's Apollo program. Flown in low Earth orbit, it was the second crewed Apollo mission that the United States launched via a Saturn V rocket, and was the first flight of the full Apollo spacecraft, the Command and Service Module with the Lunar Module. The mission was flown to qualify the Lunar Module for lunar orbit operations in preparation for the first moon landing, by demonstrating its descent and ascent propulsion systems, showing that its crew could fly it independently, then rendezvous and dock with the CSM again. The 3-man crew consisted of Commander James McDivitt, Command Module Pilot David Scott, and Lunar Module Pilot Rusty Schweikart. During the 10-day mission, they tested systems and procedures critical to landing on the moon, including the LM engines, backpack life support systems, navigation systems, and docking maneuvers. After launching on March 3, 1969, the crew performed the first crewed flight of a lunar module, the first docking and extraction of the same, one 2-person spacewalk, and the second docking of 2 crewed spacecraft. The mission concluded on March 13 and was a complete success. It proved the lunar module worthy of crewed spaceflight, setting the stage for the dress rehearsal for the lunar landing, Apollo 10, before the ultimate goal, landing on the moon. Apollo 10 was the 4th human spaceflight in the United States Apollo program, and the second to orbit the moon. The mission operators described it as a dress rehearsal for the first moon landing. The Apollo 10 mission encompassed all aspects of an actual crewed lunar landing, except the landing. It was the first flight of a complete, crewed Apollo spacecraft to operate around the moon. Objectives included a scheduled 8-hour lunar orbit of the separated lunar module, and descent to about 9 miles off the moon's surface, before ascending for rendezvous and docking with the command and service module. After the spacecraft reached lunar orbit, astronaut John Young remained in the command and service module, while astronauts Thomas Stafford and Gene Cernan flew the Apollo lunar module to within 7.8 miles of the lunar surface. Later they rejoined Young in the CSM, and after the command module completed its 31st orbit of the moon, they returned safely to Earth. Stafford and Cernan also observed and photographed Apollo 11's planned landing site in the Sea of Tranquility. Apollo 10 spent 61 hours and 37 minutes orbiting the moon. For about 8 hours of which Stafford and Cernan flew the LM apart from Young in the CSM. Additionally, Apollo 10 set the record for the highest speed attained by a crewed vehicle, 24,791 miles per hour on May 26, 1969, during the return from the moon. The mission's call signs were the names of the Peanuts characters Charlie Brown for the CSM and Snoopy for the LM. They became Apollo 10's semi-official mascots. Peanuts creator Charles Schulz also drew mission-related artwork for NASA. Apollo 11 was the American spaceflight that first landed humans on the moon. Commander Neil Armstrong and lunar module pilot Buzz Aldrin landed the Apollo lunar module Eagle on July 20, 1969. Armstrong became the first person to step onto the moon's surface on July 21 at 2:56 a.m. Aldrin joined him later, and they spent about 2¼ hours together exploring the site they had named Tranquility Base upon landing. Armstrong and Aldrin collected 47.5 pounds of lunar material to bring back to Earth as pilot Michael Collins flew the command module Columbia in lunar orbit. They were on the moon's surface for 21 hours, 36 minutes before lifting off to rejoin Columbia. Apollo 11 was launched by a Saturn V rocket from Kennedy Space Center on Merritt Island, Florida, on July 16, and it was the 5th crewed mission of NASA's Apollo program. The astronauts traveled for 3 days until they entered lunar orbit. Armstrong and Aldrin then moved into Eagle and landed in the Sea of Tranquility on July 20. The astronauts used Eagle's ascent stage to lift off from the lunar surface and rejoin Collins in the command module. All the 3 astronauts returned to Earth and splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24 after more than 8 days in space. Armstrong's first step onto the lunar surface was broadcast on live TV to a worldwide audience. An estimated 1 million spectators watched the launch of Apollo 11 from the highways and beaches in the vicinity of the launch site. The launch was televised live in 33 countries, with an estimated 25 million viewers in the United States alone. Apollo 11 effectively proved U.S. victory in the space race to demonstrate spaceflight superiority, by fulfilling the national goals set by President John F. Kennedy. Apollo 12 was the 6th crewed flight in the United States Apollo program and the 2nd to land on the moon. It was launched on November 14, 1969, from the Kennedy Space Center, Florida. Commander Charles Conrad and lunar module pilot Alan Bean performed just over 1 day and 7 hours of lunar surface activity while command module pilot Richard Gordon remained in lunar orbit. After the success of Apollo 11, Apollo 12 was postponed by 2 months. More time was allotted for geologic training in preparation for Apollo 12. Conrad and Bean made several geology field trips in preparation for their mission. Shortly after being launched, the spacecraft was twice struck by lightning, causing instrumentation problems but little damage. Switching to the auxiliary power supply resolved the data relay problem, saving the mission. On November 19, Conrad and Bean achieved a precise landing at their expected location. In making a pinpoint landing, they showed that NASA could plan future missions in the expectation that astronauts could land close to sites of scientific interest. Conrad and Bean carried the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, a group of nuclear-powered scientific instruments, as well as the first color television camera taken by an Apollo mission to the lunar surface. Lunar Module, Intrepid, lifted off from the Moon on November 20th and docked with the Command Module. The Apollo 12 mission ended on November 24th with a successful splashdown. Apollo 13 was the 7th crewed mission in the Apollo space program, and the 3rd meant to land on the Moon in the From Morrow area. The craft was launched from Kennedy Space Center on April 11, 1970, but the lunar landing was aborted after rupture of service module oxygen tank 2 days into the mission. The mission was commanded by Jim Lovell, with Jack Swigert as Command Module pilot and Fred Hayes as Lunar Module pilot. Swigert was a late replacement for Ken Mattingly, who was grounded after exposure to rubella. A routine stir of an oxygen tank damaged wire insulation inside it, causing an explosion that vented the contents of both of the service module's oxygen tanks. Without oxygen, the service module's propulsion and life support systems could not operate. The command module's systems had to be shut down to conserve its remaining resources for re-entry, forcing the crew to transfer to the lunar module as a lifeboat. With the lunar landing cancelled, mission controllers worked to bring the crew home alive. Although the LM was designed to support 2 men for 2 days, Mission Control in Houston improvised new procedures so it could support 3 men for 4 days. The crew experienced great hardship, caused by limited power, a chilly and wet cabin and a shortage of potable water. An investigative review board found fault with pre-flight testing of the oxygen tank and Teflon being placed inside it. The board recommended changes, including minimizing the use of potentially combustible items inside the tank. Tens of millions watched the splashdown in the South Pacific Ocean on television. The mission was classified as a successful failure because of the experience gained in rescuing the crew. Apollo 14 was the 8th crewed mission in the United States Apollo program, the 3rd to land on the Moon, and the 1st to land in the lunar highlands. It was the last of the H missions, landings at specific sites of scientific interest on the Moon for 2-day stays with 2 lunar extravehicular activities. Commander Alan Shepard, Command Module pilot Stuart Roosa, and Lunar Module pilot Edgar Mitchell launched on their 9-day mission on Sunday, January 31, 1971. Shepard and Mitchell made their lunar landing on February 5 in the From Morrow Formation. During the 2 walks on the surface, they collected 94.35 pounds of moon rocks and deployed several scientific experiments. In Apollo 14's most famous event, Shepard hit 2 golf balls he had brought with him with a makeshift club. Roosa took several hundred seeds on the mission, many of which were germinated on return, resulting in the so-called moon trees, that were widely distributed in the following years. After liftoff from the lunar surface and a successful docking, the spacecraft was flown back to Earth where the 3 astronauts splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean on February 9. Apollo 15 was the 4th United States Apollo program to land on the Moon. It was the first, J mission, with a longer stay on the Moon and a greater focus on science than earlier landings. Apollo 15 saw the first use of the lunar roving vehicle. Commander David Scott and Lunar Module pilot James Irwin landed near Hadley Rill and explored the local area using the rover, allowing them to travel further from the lunar module than had been possible on previous missions. They spent 18.5 hours on the Moon's surface, conducted 4 extravehicular activities, and collected 170 pounds of surface material. During the return trip, Wardens performed the first spacewalk in deep space. The Apollo 15 mission splashed down safely on August 7 despite the loss of one of its 3 parachutes. Apollo 15 set several new records for crewed spaceflight. Heaviest payload of approximately 107,000 pounds placed in a lunar orbit. Maximum radial distance traveled on the lunar surface away from the spacecraft of about 17.5 miles. Most lunar surface EVAs. Longest time in lunar orbit. Longest Apollo mission of 295 hours. The first satellite placed in lunar orbit by a crewed spacecraft, and first deep space EVA. Apollo 16 was the penultimate Apollo space program to land on the Moon. It was the second of Apollo's J missions, with a focus on science, and the use of the lunar roving vehicle. The landing and exploration were in the Descartes Highlands, a site chosen because scientists expected it to be an area formed by volcanic action, though this proved not to be the case. The mission was crewed by Commander John Young, Lunar Module Pilot Charles Duke and Command Module Pilot Ken Mattingly. Launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida on April 16, 1972, Apollo 16 experienced a number of minor glitches en route to the Moon. There was a problem with the spaceship's main engine that resulted in a 6-hour delay in the Moon landing, as NASA managers contemplated having the astronauts abort the mission and return to Earth, before deciding the problem could be overcome. Young and Duke spent 71 hours on the lunar surface, during which they conducted 3 moonwalks. They collected 211 pounds of lunar samples for return to Earth, including Big Muley, the largest moon rock collected during the Apollo missions. During the return trip to Earth, Mattingly performed a 1-hour spacewalk to retrieve several film cassettes from the exterior of the service module. Apollo 16 returned safely to Earth on April 27, 1972. Apollo 17 was the final mission of NASA's Apollo program, the 6th and most recent time humans have set foot on the Moon or traveled beyond low Earth orbit. Commander Gene Cernan and Lunar Module pilot Harrison Schmitt walked on the Moon, while Command Module pilot Ronald Evans orbited above. Schmitt was the only professional geologist to land on the Moon. The 2 primary goals of this mission were to sample lunar highland material, and to investigate the possibility of relatively recent volcanic activity. They therefore selected Taurus Littrove as the landing site, where formations were thought to be volcanic in nature. Apollo 17 was a J-type mission that included 3 days on the lunar surface, expanded scientific capability, and the use of the 3rd lunar roving vehicle. The spacecraft successfully returned to Earth on December 19. Mission control in Houston was filled with many former flight controllers and astronauts, who applauded as America returned to Earth. The Apollo program has been described as the greatest technological achievement in human history. A total of 12 astronauts walked on the Moon and conducted scientific research there.